Hello, let me ask you people one wonderful question. Imagine you are a British official in the year 1920. Your government control territories in East Africa. You have spent money building railways. You have spent money maintaining administrators. You have spent money on military forces. Now ask yourself, what would you expect in return? Obviously, you will expect economic returns. This is one of the most important ideas for understanding colonial economics. We want to understand colonial economics in the eastern part of Africa. So before colonial rule, most East African societies operated within mixed economies. People farmed, people raised livestock, people traded, people produced for local consumption. There were certainly wealth, but the majority of production was designed to sustain communities. The economy was largely organized around local needs. Colonial government changed this dramatically. They introduced cash crops. One of the biggest transformations involved agriculture. Instead of focusing primarily on food production, colonial governments encouraged production of export crops. These became known as cash crops. Examples included coffee, tea, sisal, cotton, wheat, pyrethrum, and etc. Now, let's think about this carefully. Coffee cannot feed a family, tea cannot feed a family, same as to sisal, and pyrethrum is not excluded. These crops have value because they can be sold. This means agricultural activity became increasingly connected to international markets. So before we continue, guys, I like to introduce two fascinating individuals because they help us understand how colonial economic restructuring actually worked on the ground. Sometimes when we discuss colonialism, we speak about governments and systems, but systems are always implemented by real people. In East Africa, two important figures were Lord Delamere and Lord Maurice Egerton. Let's start with Lord Delamere. Lord Delamere was one of the most influential European settlers in colonial Kenya. Lord Delamere arrived in Kenya in the late 19th century and became convinced that the Kenyan highlands had enormous agricultural potential. What made these islands attractive? Because some of the factors include because they had moderate temperatures, fertile volcanic soils, reliable rainfall, large areas suitable for commercial farming. Delamere invested heavily in agriculture. He experimented with wheat farming, livestock production, and commercial agriculture. Now, from one perspective, Delamere can be viewed as an entrepreneur because he took risks, he invested capital, he introduced new farming techniques, he helped create commercial agriculture on a large scale. But from another perspective, his successes raises difficult historical questions. Why? Because access to large areas of fertile land was made possible by colonial power structures. Many African communities lost access to land that had previously supported their livelihoods. So, when historians evaluate Lord Delamere, they often ask, was he simply an innovative investor, or was his success dependent upon unequal colonial institutions? The answer is probably that both perspectives contain some truth. This is why history becomes interesting. The same individual can be viewed differently depending on the lens that we are using. Now let's move to Lord Maurice Egerton of Tarleton. Lord Maurice arrived in Kenya during the colonial period and became another important landowner and agricultural developer. Many people in Kenya today know his name because of Egerton University, and by the way, I'm a proud alumni of Egerton University. So Egerton believed that modern agricultural techniques could increase productivity. He invested in farming, raising livestock, and livestock improvement in general, and agricultural education. Eventually, his estate became the foundation of one of Kenya's most important universities. This creates an interesting historical contrast. Like Delamere, Egerton benefited from colonial structures, yet part of his legacy evolved into an educational institution that continues serving Kenya today. Maybe one of the questions that you can ask yourself, when you examine figures such as Delamere and Egerton, how should we evaluate their historical legacy? Yeah, you can try to think about that question at your own time. And there is a very fascinating story about Lord Maurice Egerton when he came into Kenya and things happened and he never got married until he died in 1958 in Nakuru County in Kenya, and the baronage or his lineage came to an end. So he was the last baron of the Egertons. Anyway, that's a story for another day. You can talk it someday later on. So by the way, the goal was not only about agriculture. Let's use a case study of a railway example. Let's use Kenya as a good example. The famous Kenya-Uganda railway was built primarily because colonial governments wanted to improve let me restructure the statement. The colonial government did not build the Kenya-Uganda railway, for instance, because they wanted to improve local transportation. No, that's not right. That was a secondary effect. The main primary effect was for their own economic purposes. Railways allowed goods to move easily from the interior to the ports and from the ports to the interior. Ports allowed goods to reach international markets. In simple terms, railways connected production zones to export zones. So for investment insight, now this is an insight for any individual who wants to invest maybe in East Africa, probably in either Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, or Rwanda, or Burundi. Even today, infrastructure often follows economic priorities. When investors examine transportation networks, ports, logistics corridors, and railways, they should always ask, what economic objective was this infrastructure originally designed to serve? History often provides the answer. Now, another point is taxation and labor. This is a very fascinating topic, labor. Colonial governments needed workers. They needed people to work on plantations, on railways, in mines, in administrative projects, and so on and so forth. But there was a problem. Many people already lived with self-sustaining communities. They had little reason to seek wage labor, or maybe even no reason to seek wage labor. So how do you encourage people to join the colonial economy? One answer was taxation. The colonials introduced what we call hat tax. Colonial government introduced taxes, for example, hat tax, as I have said, and poll tax. These taxes had to be paid in cash. That sounds simple, yeah, but think carefully. If someone lives in a subsistence economy and suddenly must pay taxes in cash, what happens? They need money. To get money, they need wage labor. To get wage labor, they enter the colonial economy. Maybe a question that you can try to evaluate at some point. Would you describe taxation here as simple revenue collection? The model answer is not entirely. Taxation also functioned as a behavioral tool. It changed incentives. It encouraged participation in colonial labor markets. So taxation was not only about funding government, it was also about restructuring the East African labor. Now there is what we call also dependence. This is one of the most important concepts in developing, in development studies, dependence. As East Africa economies became export-oriented, they increasingly depended on global markets. This produced opportunities, but it also produced vulnerabilities. Imagine coffee price rise, farmers benefit, yes, governments benefit, exports earning increase. Now imagine coffee prices collapse. The opposite is true. So the question that you must ask yourself, why might dependence on one or two major exports create long-term economic risk? Maybe a model answer can be because external events can have major consequences. Yes. So countries lose control over important parts of their economic future. Global market fluctuations become domestic economic problems. Some of the modern examples that I can give or we can talk about is, for example, Kenya today. Kenya remains a major tea exporter. Uganda remains a major coffee exporter. Many African economies remain heavily dependent on commodity exports. This is not accidental. The roots often lie on colonial economic structures. For investors, this matters greatly for you guys. An investor who understands only today's market data sees one picture. An investor who understands historical economic structures sees a much deeper picture, because they will understand why certain industries dominate, why infrastructure exists where it does, why government prioritizes certain sectors, and why some economic vulnerability persist. So history becomes a strategic tool. Well, this has been about the economic structures of East Africa when the colonialists arrived and how they tried to change the whole economic structure from subsistence farming to cash crop farming. Let's talk about a little bit about independence movements. Let's move forward in time. So as colonial rule continued, resistance grew. People began demanding self-government. However, independence did not occur in the same way everywhere. This is important. Many people speak about African independence as though it was one event. In reality, every country followed its own path. In Kenya, it was led by the Mau Mau movement. One of the major issues was land. Large areas of fertile land had been occupied by settlers. Example, I had given Lord Delamere and Lord Morris Egerton. So many Africans view this as fundamental injustice. Eventually, resistance intensified. This became known as the Mau Mau movement. The struggle became violent. The colonial government responded with military force. Thousands suffered, many were imprisoned, and many people lost their lives. So the question that you guys should ask yourself, why was land an emotional issue? A good answer can be because land represented identity, it represented heritage, land represented security and power. So Kenya's independence movement was heavily influenced by questions of land and political rights. Uganda followed a different path. Uganda negotiated for her independence. At first glance, Uganda and Kenya appear quite similar. They were both British colonies, correct? They were both located in East Africa, correct? They were both influenced by colonial economic and political systems, yet their paths to independence were remarkably different. Kenya experienced violent anti-colonial struggle through the Mau Mau movement. Uganda largely achieved her independence through political negotiations. So why? To answer that question, we need to understand something important about Uganda before colonial rule. Unlike Kenya, Uganda contained several long-established kingdoms. The most important of these was the Kingdom of Buganda. Buganda was not a small tribal community. It was a well-sophisticated, well-organized kingdom. The king was known as the Kabaka. It had administrative officials, taxation systems, organized military structures, strong cultural identity. So when British colonial officials arrived, they discovered something very important. They found an existing political institution capable of governing large number of people. So instead of destroying the Buganda kingdom, the British largely incorporated it into the colonial system through indirect rule. So indirect rule meant government through existing local leaders. This meant that many political structures survived in colonial rule. Okay? So that's about the Buganda kingdom. So as independence approached in the 1950s and in the 1960s, political leaders already had institutions through which they could negotiate. This created a very different environment from Kenya. In Kenya, conflict over land and settler domination had created conditions for violent resistance. In Uganda, negotiations became more feasible because organized political institutions already existed. Maybe a question that you can answer for yourself at your own convenient time. So imagine you're a British colonial administrator preparing for a territory for independence. Which situation would be easier to manage? A territory with no strong political institutions, or a territory with already established kingdoms and recognized leaders? Maybe I can just give you an insight or my view is that most administrators would probably choose the second option. Why? Because negotiations require people who possess legitimacy and authority. The Kabaka of Buganda and other traditional leaders already had influence and recognition among their populations. These created channels for political dialogue. Now, the road to independence. As independence approached, constitutional conferences became increasingly important, right? Political leaders debated questions such as how much power should be the central government have? What role should traditional kingdoms play? How should different regions be represented? How should power be shared after independence? So this discussion eventually led to Uganda achieving her independence in the year 1962. Compared with Kenya, the transition was generally less violent. However, this does not mean Uganda's problems disappeared. No. In fact, some of the compromises made during independence created tensions that would later contribute to political instability in Uganda. Remember, Uganda had never done a general election where people vote until around 1991 is when the first time Uganda voted. And remember, they got their independence in 1962. Now, let's connect this to a broader lesson, investor insight. Many investors focus only on present-day conditions, but historical institutional development matters enormously. Uganda demonstrates that the strength of pre-colonial institutions can influence how a country navigates major political transitions. This is an important reminder that history is not simple or simply about the past. Historical institutions often continue shaping political outcomes decades later. So Kenya's path to independence was heavily shaped by conflict and armed resistance. Uganda's path to independence was heavily shaped by negotiation, constitutional bargaining, and the survival of strong pre-colonial institutions such as the Buganda Kingdom. The question that you can ask yourself, why might strong local institutions make negotiations easier? A model answer can be because these are recognized leaders who can participate in discussions and represent different interests. Let's talk a little bit about Rwanda, social revolution. And this is perhaps one of the most fascinating and tragic examples in East African history. Unlike Kenya, where the struggle focused heavily on land and settler rule, and unlike Uganda, where negotiations played a major role, Rwanda followed a path that was deeply influenced by questions of identity, political power, and social hierarchy. To understand Rwanda's independence, we must first go back to colonial period. Before colonial rule, Rwanda already contained different social groups, most notably Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa. However, historians generally agree that these categories were often more flexible than many people assume today. Identities was connected to factors such as occupation, wealth, and social status. In some cases, movements between categories was possible. The boundaries were not always rigid. When German and later Belgian colonial authorities governed Rwanda, they introduced a different approach. Colonial officials believed that populations could be classified into fixed ethnic categories. Over time, these distinctions became increasingly formalized. Identity cards were introduced, administrative positions were often distributed unevenly, political and social differences became institutionalized. This is a very important point. The colonial state did not simply govern Rwanda. It helped shape how political identity was understood. As independence approached in the 1950s, tensions increased. Many Hutu political leaders argued that political power had been contracted among Tutsi elites. At the same time, many Tutsi leaders feared losing influence and status. The result was growing political competition, but this competition was not simply about independence from Belgium. It was also about who controlled the future Rwandan state. This is why historians often describe Rwanda's transition as both an independence movement and a social revolution. Political powers shift dramatically. Political powers shifted dramatically. The existing political order was transformed. Large number of people were displaced and violence occurred, and the foundations were laid for future conflicts that would continue long after independence. Remember the 1994 genocide, which we will talk about it in our next video or in our future video. Maybe a question that you can ask yourself: imagine two societies preparing for independence. In one society, political competition revolves around economic policy. In another society, political competition revolves around identity. Which society do you guys think faces a great long-term risk? Possible answer, according to me, many political scientists would argue that identity-based competition can be particularly dangerous. Why? Because political disagreements become more than disagreement about policy. They become disagreements about belonging, representation, and power. People begin to fear not simply losing an election, they fear losing influence as a group. That can make compromise much more difficult. And the long-term consequences, and now this is an important to understand something. The events surrounding independence did not automatically lead to tragedies that Rwanda later experienced. History is never that simple. However, the tensions and political structures that emerged during the late colonial period created challenges that future governments would struggle to manage. Over the following decades, political instability continued, relations between communities became increasingly strained. Eventually, these tensions contributed to the terrible genocide of 1994. For investors, policymakers, and historians, Rwanda provides an important lesson. Historical institutions and political decisions can have consequences that extend for far beyond the moment in which they are created. The modern insight. What makes Rwanda particularly interesting today is that it is also a story of reconstruction. After one of the darkest chapters in modern African history, Rwanda embarked on a major effort to rebuild institutions, restore security, and promote economic development. Whether one agrees with all aspects of Rwanda's modern political model or not, the country demonstrates that historical trajectories are not fixed. The countries can change, institutions can evolve, and political systems can be rebuilt. So, Kenya's independence was heavily shaped by land, conflict, and anti-colonial resistance. Uganda's independence was heavily shaped by constitutional negotiations and existing political institutions. Rwanda's independence was heavily shaped by social revolution, identity politics, and struggles over who will control the post-colonial state. And these remind us of a very important lesson. Independence was not simply about ending colonial rule. It was also about deciding who will govern afterwards, how power will be distributed, and what kind of nation would emerge. Stability versus instability. After independence, East Africa leaders faced enormous challenges. Building a state is difficult. Maintaining a state is more difficult. Let's compare three countries. Tanzania. Under Julius Kambarage Nyerere, Tanzania emphasized national unity. Leadership promoted a shared national identity. The government worked to reduce ethnic competition, and national cohesion became a priority. Why do you think national identity contributes to stability? Because people begin viewing themselves as members of one political community rather than competing groups. Uganda. Uganda experienced a very different experience. Political rivalries intensified. Military interventions increased. Eventually, figures such as Idi Amin Dada emerged, and periods of instability followed. Question: what impact does instability have on an economic development? Model answer: investors become cautious. Businesses face uncertainties. Long-term planning becomes difficult. Institutional trust weakness. Rwanda. Rwanda experienced one of the most tragic events in modern African history. The 1994 genocide demonstrated how dangerous unresolved identity conflicts can become. Yet Rwanda also became a remarkable example of reconstruction. Today, many analysts study Rwanda because it demonstrates both institutional failure and institutional rebuilding. Investors' insights. Political history matters. Investors who ignore political history often misunderstand risk. Current economic indicators matter, but historical trajectories matter too. Integrated analytical framework. So pre-colonial East Africa, flexible systems, adaptive governance, local economies. Colonial East Africa, centralized administration, export-oriented economies, institutional redesign. Post-colonial East Africa, nation building, political competition, economic modernization. Modern East Africa, a hybrid system, different historical layers continue to interact, and this explains why understanding history remains valuable. Final reflection question. So, if you guys were considering a major long-term investment in East Africa, what would matter more? Current economic statistics or understanding the historical institutions that produced those statistics? Remember, there is no perfect answer, but history helps us understand why today's numbers look the way they do, and why serious investors, policymakers, and business leaders study history. Thank you very much. Bye bye.